Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg UK, a special focus on the biggest challenges facing the British government, the economy, financial services and markets. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has attempted to position himself as the agent of change in his first speech to the Conservative Party conference as leader. Now, the attempt to reframe his administration reflects both the 20-point deficit to the opposition Labour Party in opinion polls and the lack of time to turn it around before the next general election. Well, Sunak took aim at the records of previous Conservative prime ministers, some of whom he served under as he announced a raft of new policies. Now, the most controversial headline, of course, was his decision to scrap the second part of the high-speed rail project, HS2.
I am ending this long-running saga. I am cancelling the rest of the HS2 project. And in its place, we will reinvest every single penny, £36 billion, in hundreds of new transport projects in the North and the Midlands across the country. This means £36 billion of investment in the projects that will make a real difference across our nation.
Let's discuss with Bloomberg's Caroline Hepker and Joe Mays. Both were at the party conference. Joe is still in Manchester. I don't know how you got back, Caroline, because it was actually quite hard because of the train strike as well. So you were in Manchester 4 days, both of you. There's been quite a lot of reaction on actually HS2 and whether, does that help with the polls longer term?
Well, this is the big question. Reinvesting the money in road and rail projects, that was the pitch that the Prime Minister made to the party faithful, the grassroots who were gathered for this major jamboree. It's an annual event. The Prime Minister confirmed what had hung over this whole conference was high-speed rail 2, the biggest rail infrastructure project that the UK has seen in decades. He did say that he would cancel it, and he used that word. The reaction, though, particularly from Manchester and the Labour Manchester Mayor, has been harsh. Extremely frustrated and disappointed that this high-speed bullet train basically up to the city where the conference was taking place is not going to now happen, and saying that it really weakens the credentials that the Conservative Party have for being the party of business. And also they're very dubious about whether the money would be reinvested or exactly how it would be reinvested in road and rail projects in the North and the Midlands. So I was speaking to Andy Burnham, the Manchester Mayor. He gave a press conference after the Prime Minister spoke at party conference. This is what Andy Burnham had to say.
It never helps anybody when a country rips up plans that have been worked on for a long time, because businesses then look at that and think, God, we need more stability than that. So I don't understand how the Conservative Party, which once called itself the party of business, can look at its own behaviour this week and think that's consistent with a party that's about bringing growth to the regions or investment to the regions.
So that was Andy Burnham, the Greater Manchester Mayor, speaking to me only yesterday. I did ask him whether he wanted the Labour Party to recommit to HS2 were they to win in the next general election, which we know has to take place basically next year. He wasn't boxing them in to that, but he was frustrated, along with the chair of the Manchester Business Board, John Caudwell, who also spoke to me yesterday. They were frustrated that there was no engagement from the Prime Minister or his team, that they were there in the city. They could have collaborated. They were trying to paint themselves as very reasonable with the collaboration of a lot of business leaders in that city, saying we were here in the same rooms, we could have had that discussion, and we didn't, and they were very angry about that.
And Joe, what did you make of, in general, so I've heard from various quarters that actually it was a little bit different this time, that you didn't have the kind of the wow factor that we've seen at previous party conferences, that in terms of policy there was quite a lot because they're fighting now for the next election, but at the same time it maybe wasn't as colourful as in the past.
Yeah, there was a consensus that it was rather flat in Manchester, no real major excitement in the main hall. I mean, if anything, the most drama was coming on a few of the fringe events where you had former Prime Minister Liz Truss holding a growth rally attended by the likes of Nigel Farage, for example. That created a bit of a buzz, but broadly speaking, it felt like a party that knew and knows that it is well behind in the polls, needs to do something about it, and is struggling. And I think that permeated throughout the conference. There was a slightly dour feel to it all, and Rishi trying to reinvigorate matters with this big pivot on HS2, the pivot on the green agenda, but the polls haven't really moved in the way they would want, and so yeah, slightly dour.
But so, do you think that now everything we're going to hear from the Prime Minister and the government is just to win votes? So are we going to see actually more 180-degree turns on certain things, like we heard, for example, on climate change, because they're looking at the numbers or looking at the polls and they'll do anything to try and get ahead?
I think that's exactly how to think about what this Prime Minister is currently doing. Him and his core team, they look at those polls and they think, look, we're going to be out of power in a year's time unless something changes. So we have to do something. It's a backs against the wall moment effectively for Rishi. And that's why we've seen the green agenda pivot. We now have this HS2 move as well. Him and his team are saying there will be more like this in the coming weeks and months. We have an autumn statement coming up from Jeremy Hunt in November. So that could be another opportunity to do things. They've got announcements planned on things like improving the electricity grid. That there's potential moves on things like inheritance tax coming down the line. We're looking for potential tax cuts in the spring budget. So there are plenty of opportunities to do more like this, create dividing lines with Labour, try and have a sell to the public, because if you don't do that, he's likely going to lose the next election.
Yeah. So, Caroline, what did we learn in terms of how he's going to do this and what the key points that he wants to focus on?
I think the remarkable thing is that Rishi Sunak is not running on the 13-year history of the Tory government or any of its achievements. He was talking about fundamentally changing Britain. I think that raised some eyebrows, frankly, in the room, of party faithful that were there yesterday. He kept referring to the past 30 years, which therefore includes the last Labour government. I think that, as Joe says, there is a realisation that the party is quite behind in the polls. There were some good moments. For example, the Prime Minister's wife who introduced him, that was seen as perhaps potentially quite an asset for him. Penny Mordaunt also gave a real kind of barnstorming speech. She really did seem to try to rally people to the fight, and she kept talking about fighting. And if you fight, then the person next to you fights. So they understand that it's going to...
I heard that speech. It's quite tough. There's a lot of fighting
and a lot of more references. So I think that really you understood from that speech just how keen and perhaps even desperate the party is to that they have to deal with the lag behind the Labour Party. And of course the Labour Party will get the last word because their conference starts on Sunday.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward actually to the coverage. It's been superb from all of the Bloomberg team. Caroline, thank you so much. Caroline Hepker and Joe Mays. Now coming up, we're joined by Kelly Beaver, the Chief Executive of Ipsos UK, as we take a look at national polling in the midst of the party conference season. This is Bloomberg.
That person who would be game-changing in terms of unlocking that value for the UK company, unlocking that market, would have to be paid more than the CEO and wouldn't be able to have any performance-related pay on top of what they started at, and is probably still taking a pay cut from what they'd be paid to work for an Asian company or a US company or even sometimes a European company.
That was the Chief Executive of the London Stock Exchange, Julia Hoggett, warning that the UK's restriction on executive pay are hindering companies' efforts to recruit top talent after Brexit. Now, you can listen to that full interview. She was on fire. It was a great interview, a great listen on Bloomberg's In the City podcast that I host along David Merritt on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, I would also be very grateful if you rate and review it, and that new episode dropped this morning. Now, let's return to politics and what it all means for polling. According to the latest data from Ipsos, listen to this, nearly 9 in 10 Britons believe that Britain needs a fresh team of leaders. Now, for more on this, we're joined by Kelly Beaver, Chief Executive of Ipsos UK. Kelly, thank you for joining us. I mean, you understand, I love it's so hard actually asking people questions that make sense of the mood of the country. What at the moment is the most surprising thing when you speak to people about leadership, about their politicians and about the Conservatives?
Well, unfortunately, there's nothing surprising when we look at the data. We are seeing a really declinism attitude amongst the British population. 7 in 10 think that the country is in a worse place to live than it was 10 years ago. And we're seeing, as you say, the change in leader point really being something that the public is very passionate about. So Rishi Sunak's speech in the conference and trying to both appeal to his base of 2019 Conservative voters, but also really demonstrate a bit of a shift in the delivery momentum was not a massive surprise either.
And so is there any points, and actually, I mean, and we know, and we've heard it from Joe Mays and also Caroline Hepker, that, you know, a lot of the Tory party advisors are probably looking at the polls, they're in campaign mode, and are trying to get back that unbalance because Labour is doing so much better than them. But what are they looking at that could make people shift? Is it climate change? Is it even infrastructure, cost of living?
So the big things for them are having clear dividing lines between the policies of the Conservative Party and the policies of Labour. And this is something where it has not been as clear for the general population and the general public over the last 12 months. But with some of the clear dividing lines now being drawn around net zero, about HS2, some of those things are going to create a real shape around the policies for the Conservative Party. But the other thing for them is a lack of faith in government delivery. And when we look at how the public feel about how Rishi Sunak and his government are delivering on the 5 key pledges that they set out, there's a high majority of people who do not believe that they're doing a good job. So part of it is the dividing lines and being clear on the policies, but also being able to demonstrate that there is some delivery momentum. So even the change in the smoking, that piece, that piece, there will be a majority of the population. We've looked at some polls that have been done when that kind of policy came in New Zealand and polls done here by More in Common in the UK. There will be a good proportion of the population who think that is a really good policy. But I don't think that's going to be a dividing line. I think Labour will be more, equally in support of that.
But Kelly, is that so? For example, smoke. It's interesting because it's easy to deliver, right? As long as everybody votes for it. But if it gets put in place and it's something that's very actionable,
it is.
Are you going to see policies like that because your polls are saying that they just don't trust the Tory government?
I think there will be a range of short-term delivery mechanisms that government want to put in place. The big thing, I was at the conference earlier this week, the big thing that was a focus was we are going to fix inflation. That is what the Conservative Party were saying. And that is one of the core pledges that they have made to the British population. And there's a lot hanging on the delivery of that pledge in the Conservative member mindset. Once that moves, we can see if that does move and they manage to solve that problem, the public will shift their concerns, and we can see from the issues index that we have, which tracks spontaneous concern, that beneath the surface of inflation, when that goes away, it's NHS, it's public services, it's delivery around the immigration control that also the public are keen to see.
I mean, I find it very difficult because it's not only the government, right? It's a whole confluence of things that leads to inflation. So the idea that the government can have it is a little bit odd when you look at the economics of it. Talk to me about climate change.
Yes, indeed. So there have
people care, or are they trying to go for a certain part of the population where actually we think that we've gone too far?
So overall, the public in the UK, they do believe that climate change is a problem and we need to act. What the Conservative government have done with the shift in the net zero pledges and the timeframes, they are appealing to the 2019 Conservative vote, but they're also recognising what we have seen as a more nuanced view in public opinion about acting now. So whilst the public say to us, the majority would say, yes, we recognise this is a short-term decision, framing short-term concerns. Over half of the public are also saying they can't really think about climate change and the environment today because they're so worried about their own cost of living. So it is appealing to both the 2019 Conservative vote, but also those who are on lower incomes and more likely to feel the squeeze from some of the increases perhaps in their own lifestyle costs as a result of the policy shifts.
Kelly, Labour's doing really well. Is there a danger that, when we talk about this Ming vase that they just can't drop, but actually if there's not a bit of gusto or a little bit of policy behind it, that they're just going to slip in the polls?
So the gap, the voting intention poll that you show, that is a very crude indication of voting intention support. Looking beneath the surface of that, and we look at things like, do you believe Labour are fit to govern? Actually, there hasn't been a lot of movement in indicators like that. They tend to be about 30 to 40% of people, and has been for a long period of time, who believe they're fit to govern. What's happened? the proportion of people who think the Conservatives are fit to govern has dropped substantively. So you can see that it is more declinist view of overall context, negative views of the party brand for the Conservatives, and perception of failure to deliver rather than a love of Labour.
And so that, I guess, can change without the right policies in place, right?
That's right. And I think when we get to the time of a general election, people vote on leaders, they vote on parties, but they also vote on policies. And I think policies will be a big issue at the next election.
Kelly, thank you so much. Kelly Beaver, there, the Chief Executive of Ipsos, looking at some really, really interesting polls and analysis. Coming up, Rishi Sunak's U-turn on the government's green agenda. As we were just saying, under fire. We'll hear from one of his critics next. This is Bloomberg. UK billionaire and founder of Phones for You, John Caudwell, was one of the Conservative Party's most prominent donors. But he's now extremely critical of the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's U-turn on green policies. Well, Caudwell has been lobbying the government for the past 3.5 years to try and create an environmental tech enterprise zone in the UK. He joins us now. So, John Caudwell, welcome to Bloomberg. First of all, Mr. Caudwell, why do you think the Prime Minister did that U-turn on some of the climate policies?
I think the UK population were a bit misinformed about what net zero means and what 2030 meant in terms of internal combustion engines. And instead of selling the positives and any negatives that there might be for people, explaining those negatives and explaining how the government would subsidise those negatives to turn the whole thing into a virtuous circle, I think he went for the easy votes. And it was a popular decision to reverse from 2030 to 2035, but it was completely the wrong decision. There's nothing more important for the world than the environment. And for Britain, there's nothing more important than growing our GDP. And we could have done both of those things at the same time.
Do you think, because of the decision, this decision, international investments or international investors will less likely invest in the UK?
Well, I think that's going to be a certain tendency, because what any investor wants is consistency. They want a government that sets the parameters in the economy and sticks to them and doesn't chop and change. And the chopping and changing is always detrimental to businesses. So, yes, on that score, yes, but I wanted them to go a lot further than that. I wanted a real big investment in the UK from outside investors. And it wouldn't cost anything at all to create an enterprise zone that's tax-free for inward investment to come in that are government approved in terms of their scientific technology on an environmental platform. And in that way, we could have grown our GDP enormously over the next 10 to 20 years, grown Britain and helped to save the planet at the same time.
John, do you think actually investment will leave the UK because of the government's green agenda or non-green agenda?
I don't think it'll leave the UK particularly, no, because I think it would require something more radical than that. But we're already a high tax regime. We're not investing enough in the future of Britain. And it doesn't look very smart for the future of Britain. And so it certainly won't be doing a lot to attract, other than the fact, and I would make this statement very strongly, that I think Great Britain is a very, very attractive country for people to come to live through in from many perspectives. But we need to be better. We can't be complacent. We need to be better. And we've seen our economy in the doldrums pretty much for the whole of this century, for 20 years. So we really need to get our fingers out and be proactive in investing in future.
Yeah. Are you frustrated with the state of the Tories right now? You have been a big donor. Will you continue to do so?
Well, I am very frustrated, yes, because there's so many ideas that are put forward to government, so much that I believe we can do. And from my perspective as a businessman, just no-brainer ideas that you don't even have to think about. You just have to think about how do you how do you implement them, and how do you maximise the benefit from them. And so, yes, I am extremely frustrated. At the moment, I find myself in a bit of an apolitical space because I believe in Great Britain. I believe in investing in Great Britain. I believe in making Great Britain really, truly successful in the future, narrowing the poor-rich divide, and doing all the things that gives the average working person a better standard of living. But it can only come from GDP growth. So you have to do that. So I'm not a supporter of anybody at the moment. I'm almost ashamed to say I'm a floating voter because I've always been crystal clear about who I was going to vote for over the last 50 years.
But so, John, does it mean, and we've heard it from a lot of chief executives actually, that they have been wooed or at least impressed by Labour? Could Labour also impress you with some of the pro-business chatter that they've been talking about?
Yeah, I think the Labour's rhetoric is very good. It's very pro-business. It's very pro the environment and ticks a lot of boxes. And Keir makes it clear that he wants to listen to business people and their ideas. But, you know, there's a big difference between electioneering and implementation. So whilst it does interest me, and I don't rule Labour out at all, at the same time, I am apolitical at the moment. I have my crystal clear views, and no party, John, I don't feel any party properly represents my views.
But so if you're apolitical at the moment, would you rule out possibly being a Labour donor if they prove, you know, to be worthy for business?
I think, Francine, it's the same answer, you know, that I will support any party that I believe is investing in the right methodologies in Great Britain, not just throwing money at the voters, but investing in Great Britain, in our future, to make Britain great again, to give us a better GDP growth so that helps everybody from the poorest members of society right through to the businesses.
Yeah. John, a real great pleasure to speak to you today. I hope you come back really soon, maybe in the studio next time. John Caudwell, entrepreneur and founder of Phones for You. Up next, Bloomberg Brief. We'll have a full roundup of some of the Treasury upheaval and, of course, a lot of the focus on equities. Danny Berger, Manus Cranny. This is Bloomberg.